This Three Beards Media podcast may contain mature themes, and if you're not down with that, we got 3 words for you. Like the podcast. Nailed it!
Would you like to sample some of my nuts?
Hello, and welcome back yet again to another edition of Old Man Strength, a podcast of Three Beards Media and brought to you by Revelton Distilling Company. I am Tim Johnson, joined as always by Chris Shipley. Chris, how are we doing this evening?
Oh, I'm much better today than I was yesterday.
What's wrong with yesterday?
Yesterday was closer to Monday when I was going to have an absolute meltdown on my entire family. Not my immediate family. But I was, as I jokingly said on last night's podcast, there was a brief glimpse of BS Chris, which I like to refer to as before Stacy Chris. I didn't control my temper and I was a big jerk and would just burn everybody to the ground that crossed me. So.
Well, good. That sets a lovely tone for this evening.
That's right. So I'm to answer your question honestly, I'm much better today.
Good. I'm the dummy who scheduled this during a Twins game. So viewers, when I'm looking off to the side to check the Twin score, because we are right now in a close one in the middle of the 7th, it looks like. Who knew?
Right. I mean, again, before we recorded, I said it's not really your fault. I mean, nobody would expect the Twins to be in the second round of the playoffs.
You know, it's been 32 years since a World Series, or if you're the mayor of Minneapolis, you think it's apparently been 26 because that man can't do math or bother to correct a single tweet. I don't have opinions about that, man. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest who probably also has no opinions whatsoever. This gentleman had a what I will call an illustrious TV career where he spent vampire hours to get up early in the morning and welcome all the Twin Cities to start their day before he wised up and realized that A, he didn't want to be awake in the off hours, and B, he had a face more suited for radio. So now he is a radio personality where also I think he very much appreciates the ability to speak his mind. As well as Jason, would you call yourself a food critic? Critic doesn't even seem right. How would you describe what you do?
Well, I do. I am the food critic for Minnesota Monthly, so I think a lot of people don't realize that I actually do write reviews because perhaps they've taken the Minnesota Monthly, from their dentist office or wherever they get the actual print magazine. So yes, I'm a food critic for Minnesota Monthly, but I'm more of a food commentator, I guess, or I don't know. I'm on that line between food journalist and food writer and food critic. So
yeah. So anyway, listeners, that's the voice of Jason DeRusha. Jason, welcome to Old Man Strength.
Thank you. Yes, as an old man and a bearded man, it's good to be here.
We're looking for a replacement for Tim, so let me know if you're looking. We base it based off of how well your beard is. So,
I mean, I left television to go to AM radio, so leaving AM radio to go to podcasting seems like
that's the next natural progression. Absolutely, yeah, you bet. You don't have that pesky, fines that could happen if you say something wrong.
Yeah, no, you also don't have that pesky listenership.
Right. Yeah.
Paycheck.
Exactly.
Yeah, a paycheck. There is that too. No. So, Jason, that was my very poor, very brief introduction of you. Why don't you go ahead and tell our listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. I'm Jason DeRusha. I anchored the morning news on WCCO TV for 10 years. Before that, I did a segment called Good Question that was partially viewer submitted questions and partially our questions, but we were doing that every night in our 10 o'clock news on the CBS TV station here in Minneapolis, WCCO. And then before that, I was a general news reporter. So I've been in the media here in the Twin Cities since 2003, so 20 years now, which is horrifying when teenagers or 20 somethings say they grew up watching me. You're like, oh, first you're like, it's not possible. That's not, and then you think, oh, well, yeah, sure.
Well,
You did grow up watching me. It makes sense.
I mean, you are. If I can't, if I can take a second to date you a little bit, you are a dad of college age,
It's true. Yeah. Well,
right?
I mean, we're just getting right into it then. Yes, I am old, as it turns out. Especially because we moved here without kids. My wife and I have been married. We just hit our 25th wedding anniversary, and we moved here without kids. Now I have a freshman at NYU in New York, and then I have a junior in high school at Maple Grove High School. So yeah, it's true.
So
It
when you say
happens.
you-
It comes at you fast, they say.
So when you say you moved there with your wife without any kids, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, where you come
Yeah, I grew up in suburban Chicago. Went to Marquette University in Milwaukee. While I was in college, I had an internship at ABC News in New York. So I interned with Peter Jennings and with World News Tonight. And then I also interned at the same time with Primetime Live, which was like a, 2020 Dateline NBC style show. The following year, I interned at One Room Newsroom in Rockford, Illinois. So quite a variety of different newsroom experiences I've had. But my first full-time job was in Davenport, Iowa. So I worked in the Quad Cities as a reporter for 3 years, then back to Milwaukee as a reporter for 3 years, and then here for 20. So
I didn't realize you were in Davenport. Where at Davenport were you?
KWQC,
Sure.
which was the longest out queue in TV news. So when I would do a live report, I would have to say, live in Moline or Rock Island or wherever. But live in Rock Island, Jason DeRusha, KWQC TV6 News. It just was like a letter salad of all the different.
Well, I had to explain to I don't know who was I talking to the other day. They weren't familiar. They were from the Twin Cities, and they weren't familiar with the Quad Cities.
Oh, isn't
And
that funny? Yeah.
Yeah, and I had to explain to him. Well, I said, well, first of all, I know it's the Quad, so it should be 4. But Davenport, Bettendorf, Rock Island, Moline, and East Moline all claim
Correct.
to be one of the 4 of the 5 Quad cities.
Which, how pathetic when really you're fighting for a piece of the Quad Cities. It's just sad. It's sad. Like, give it up, East Moline. It's not happening. They're desperate
Which is
for it.
funny because I mean, I grew up in the Quad City area. I grew up a half
Well,
hour
Bettendorf was
west of
nothing, right? So at a certain point,
Right, yeah.
So that's why East Moline is so bitter about it.
Yeah, exactly. But you had to have 2 on Iowa, 2 on Illinois. I think is
Gotta be
the
fair. Gotta
justification.
be fair. Yeah.
Who knows? That's a pretty. Aside from the Big 6, I can't imagine. And Quad City, I don't know what they were. Angels, River Bandits, whatever.
River Bandits, yeah, nice.
River Bandits,
Actually, a
there.
nice baseball stadium right there
It
in the
is,
river
yeah.
with the bridge. We flood all the time, always flooded. I did a lot of flooding reporting for sure, right along the Mississippi River. A lot of that. It was a pretty good news town actually to start out. Back when I was there in 1997 to 2000, there was a big military base, the Rock Island Arsenal. So it was a great first job. And my wife actually, it was not a great place to be in your low 20s because there's no major university there. So
No.
all the young people went to Iowa State or Iowa or University of Illinois or whatever. So everybody got out of there. So my wife was like, we gotta go. She's like, you gotta get a job. And she was right because for me, like I was the weekend news anchor at the #1 TV station in the Quad Cities. I thought I was rich. I was making like $25,000 a year. It was unbelievable. Alyssa had a job. I had a job. When I was hired as a reporter, I was hired for $18,000, which was $9 an hour, which was less money than I was making in my job supervising 16-inch softball leagues in my summer job in suburban Chicago. So it was like a pay cut for my part-time high school job. But yeah, so I was getting comfortable though. Like Alyssa was right that I needed a new challenge because it's possible I would still be in the Quad Cities today.
Well, for your sake
And
for
horrifying.
yeah. For your sake and ours, I'm very glad that didn't happen. I mean,
All thanks to Alyssa.
yeah, I got out. You know, I graduated high school in '97, and I never looked back for the Quad Cities, and I can't imagine living. And don't get me wrong, a great place, certainly not like you said for people in their early 20s.
It's fine. It's fine. Like it's it's one of those. There are certain places around the country that people say like, "Oh, great place to raise a family," which is sort of code for like no reason to ever go here. Right?
Yeah, no, that's true.
Sort of what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's no. I see Alexandria. No, okay. So you relocated up here, and you kind of just stuck your toe in the sand here.
Yeah, I came here at a time, and it's something that I think about a lot. And I think most people, no matter what your job is, you wonder if you get, really good at your job, it's sort of natural to wonder, am I really good at this, or did I happen to like arrive at just the right time? And I do think for me, I arrived in the Twin Cities right as sort of the digital space was starting to get going. So I was able to be first. I was the first reporter with a blog. Like I had a regular blog on the WCCO.com site. I was one of the first to be on social media. So I joined Twitter the day after the 35W bridge collapsed because some friends of mine were using Twitter when the text message function wasn't operating because the system was overloaded. So I was one of the early people digitally, and I think that helped me kind of carve out an identity in this town.
I mean, you also not that you had a lot of great co-hosts WCCO mornings, but you did have a number of them. You were kind of the stalwart mainstay for that time, and I think that helped a lot for a lot of people to wake up with you or me getting in.
Oh yeah, it's a different in being able to do the good question segment, which good question is for people who've never seen it is, the ultimate in explanatory journalism. It could be as inane as like, how does dry cleaning work? What is really going on with the water towers you see in different towns, down to questions about foreign policy and race. And so we covered all this stuff, but they ran so many commercials for it because it was a perfect tease, right? Because you just had a question and you're like, I would set it up and then I'd say, good question tonight at 10. And that would run all night long. And so people would send me videos of like in their house. Some parents would send me video of them saying good to their kid, good question. And the kid would respond tonight at 10. Like, all right, pretty good. So yeah, I mean, I just always had that personal, some of it was social media, but some of it is just like the good question segment. And then nothing is more personal than the connection you have as a morning news anchor, because the people watching you are literally getting dressed. Like they're in their bed, they're in their bathrobe, like they are going through it with you. And certainly, in my years of doing the morning news, like, we had some major things as a community, obviously, that,
Yep.
I was there guiding people through. So it was an incredible, incredible job. Um, and other if you could move the hours.
Yeah,
I
right.
y-
The hours
yeah,
are tough.
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, I made a joke introducing you about vampire hours, but what hours were you
Yeah.
working? Because I first of all, I remember either seeing your tweets way too early, but also knowing
Yeah.
well, especially
Yeah.
because your job as a food critic also had you going out to dinner, and
Going out.
I
Yeah.
wondered when the hell you slept. Um,
Uh, it wasn't great. Like, it turned out it wasn't great. As soon as I shifted into working in radio and working on the air 3 to 6 in the afternoon, I was like, "Oh, I was really tired." You sorta kinda and anyone who works shift work, you sorta just get through it, and you
yeah.
think you're
Yeah.
okay, and, like, I was not okay, but I would usually go to bed around 8:30 at night,
Uh-huh.
but I was up at 2:30 in the morning. So,
Man.
for a long time, my alarm was set at, like, 2:24, um, and people would say, like, "Well, why are you setting it for, 6 minutes early?" And I said, "Well, I'm actually setting it, 9 minutes late. I should be waking up at 2:15." So it's some of the sort of mental games you play with yourself,
I
in those
yeah.
hours.
I when I was going to college there for a while, I had purposely set my clock ahead 35 minutes because I convinced myself that when I would get up in the morning, I'd be panicked that I woke up late and then I would just get up. Somehow that
Yeah.
never worked, but I was too superstitious for like 2 years to change it
Yeah,
because I was
I
afraid
just
of
come on, Chris. Did you? I love that you set your alarm for classes you didn't go to.
No, you thought about it.
That's
You
a whole
thought about
other
it.
that's a whole other
Yeah.
that's a whole other story. I'm just saying the superstition with the clock. I was trying to relate to our guest, Tim. Thanks a lot.
It's rough. It's rough, Chris. I can relate to, like, I'm doing my part, and then some co-host, some dumb co-host or co-anchor messes up the whole bit.
Right. I know. We had this whole thing
Yeah,
going.
it's rough.
Nice job, Tim.
Whatever. Sometimes you just need someone to be the eye candy. Uh,
I also napped, so, like, 8:30 and, going to bed at 8:30 doesn't mean falling asleep at 8:30 necessarily, so, like, I
yeah.
really fall asleep around 9, so you're looking at 5.5 hours of sleep every night.
Hmm.
The nice thing about working nights is you could make a decision to be tired, so you could say, "Alright, I wanna go to this concert, or I wanna go to this sporting event," but my kids got used to leaving Timberwolves games in the 3rd quarter, leaving Twins games in about the 6th inning, like, this was the bet, like, we were gonna have to leave places early so I could go to bed.
I mean, right now, I don't know how many times I would love to be in bed at 8:30. Uh,
Yeah. 8
yeah.
minutes away, this thing's that boring, huh, Tim? You're already ready to just shut her down. I just,
Yeah.
Oh,
So
turn the lights out and
you you transitioned to radio. Did your family go? Yeah. Yeah. No. We've seen this. We've seen this lack of sleep.
Well, they have mixed feelings because for my family, the schedule, the morning TV schedule was pretty great. So I was home in the afternoon. As a dad, I could drive kids to different sporting events and whatever while my wife was working. So I was a much more useful husband uh, in the before times than I am now working in radio. So I used to help, like, I would prep dinner, we would cook together, like, so that side of things, life is a little more inconvenient for my wife now than it was before. But they certainly see that, like, I'm less irritable, like, I'm a more pleasant, not that I was ever, like, super irritable, but I'm more pleasant around the house for sure.
yeah, I can see that. Especially when you said you were working in the mornings, people were waking up, they were starting their day with you, they connected with you. I think probably more they choose that more than they say an afternoon or whatever. They may just, they're so busy, they're running around, they may just listen to whatever's on. But in the morning, I feel like you're more loyal as to who you're choosing to watch and listen
The
to.
people. Yeah. Yeah, it was an interesting challenge as you try to build morning television because usually in TV you think about the lead in. So if you have a great show on at 9 o'clock at night, it helps your 10 o'clock news. Well, the morning is sort of strange, right? Because you can't, people are going to leave the house when they have to leave the house. So no matter how good your show is, people aren't going to be like, hey, better stick around to find out what's coming up after the break. Like, I guess I'll just be 20 minutes late to work today. That's just not how people function. So they tend to relate to the people. So for me, being that steady presence over 10 years, I think was, like the station valued it for sure. And I think, yeah, that sort of personal connection. But the truth is, like, when it comes to local news, viewers pick people. That's it. So it is one of the frustrating things of working in news because you're like, well, what if we just do this kind of coverage, this will help? Or what if we spend more time in this community? Maybe that will help. Or what if we change the format and do longer stories? Or what if we do more stories or whatever the case may be? Like, this is people's job, right? So all these brain wizards are coming up with all these ideas of how to do the news in a different way. And when it comes down to it, like, the audience just picks people they like.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. Here in the Midwest, it's very difficult to win on format or content. It's pretty much people.
Well, I mean, in the morning, I want to know what my traffic is going to be on my commute into work. I want to know what my weather's going to be. I want to know if the world blew up overnight.
Right. Right.
And and I can get that on any station, right?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it's
yeah.
really more about who do I want to watch while I'm putting on my pants.
Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
You know,
And everybody does a pretty good job of the basics of the information. No one in this state is putting on a trash show. Like, everybody's pretty good. So yeah, that's what it comes down to. Good for people like me. You're like, all right. When it comes time for contract negotiations, you're like, well, we all know why people are watching. It's the people. Now the challenge is there are 4 or 5 or 6 people on these shows. So, is it me? Is it a co-anchor? Is it a weather person? Usually it's a combination. It's never like one person. It's some sort of chemistry that people like.
And I think you obviously hit it right on the head because here in Des Moines, I personally watch Channel 13. I know every one of those people on there. But when I use an app and I want to go check the weather, I never seem to use theirs. I always use the other stations because
Funny.
I think that they have a better interface. But if I want to sit down and watch the news or whatever, I never go to the one that I think maybe has the most accurate weather. I go to the people that I like to watch.
Yeah. Yeah, it drives people who work in news crazy because, you spend your day working on these things. And for me, as a former reporter, the reporters, we always, reporters always think we're underappreciated. And it's like, well, if I were screwing up the stories, no one would watch the news. And the anchors are like, that's cute. Like, they're really watching because of me. You're like, well, I'm the lead story every night. Doesn't that matter? And they're like, yeah, kid, like, keep doing a good job. Like, that's important. But like, if you left, somebody else would do the lead story. It would be fine. So it is an interesting phenomenon. You always see like management types want to, like, it's all about the content. It's all about the format. And you're like, well, no.
Do you feel like you have a connection to your audience through social media? And the reason I ask this is because a couple of months ago, we had Elias Johnson on, who is the Channel 13 anchor at 10 o'clock. And Tim and I have kind of gotten to know him. And there was one night he had responded to somebody's tweet, like during a commercial break of the 10 o'clock news. And I had replied to it and I said, I think Elias is tweeting during the 10 o'clock news. And he tweeted back and I said, okay, if you're really doing that, I dare you to say deuces at some point during the broadcast. And Keith Murphy, the sports guy, had had thrown it back to him, and before they went to break, he had threw up 2 fingers and said deuces. And I was like, oh my God, he actually did it, which
Yeah.
endears him, I think, to people and makes them want to watch him. So do you feel like you have a connection to your listeners and stuff through social media?
No question about it. I mean, and I would tweet with viewers when I was on TV, and I would have my phone on the desk, and sometimes people would see me as I was doing it.
And I think that's how Elias got caught.
Yeah, sometimes you get
found out,
caught. It happens. It's different. When I was in TV, I think I was known as sort of I was the information desk for WCCO TV. So if you needed a clip or you missed a story or you had a complaint, like people would send it to me. For better or for worse, that became me because I was there and I was responsive. And the truth is, here in 2023, social media has been a part of journalism for 15 years. It's been a mainstream
Yeah,
tool available for 10.
yeah. At least, I mean, you were like you
But
said.
people still don't use it. They
Yeah.
still don't use it. They don't use it effectively. They try to treat it like it's a television 15-second tease.
Right.
They don't kind of respond to people who are critical. They aren't very good at admitting when we screw stuff up. And I will say it's largely because the risk reward calculus is very high on the risk side and very low on the reward side. So TV stations, just like any employer, they'll say, like, we want you to be on social media. And then if you screw up once, they fire you. So, like, if I were a young person starting out, I would not encourage a young person to be. You should use Twitter as a research or X as a research tool, but I would say the risk of saying something stupid, embarrassing yourself, embarrassing your employer is too high, and there's no safety net. So,
I mean,
I
yeah.
get why people are so cautious and boring on social media.
I mean, we can think of a local weather personality who maybe ran afoul of social media mores and caused quite a hubbub.
Yeah.
And obviously things have worked out differently and not necessarily bad. But you are someone, and partially, I think you were able to get away with it for so long just because you were an early adopter of Twitter, right? Like you almost got grandfathered into the interactive portion of
Yeah.
Twitter. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
once kind of the rules were set, then I think a lot of the TV personalities just stayed company line, not really interacting with people, more just tweeting out,
Yeah.
replying and stuff. But since you had already kind of established that, I think that may
Well, and I
have
feel
worked
that
in favor.
now, like to a certain, now that I'm doing opinion talk radio, the responses that I get, because some of the topics I will kind of put out there are more polarizing or provoke strong opinions. And I sort of, there are times I wish I could put the genie back in the bottle and I could just tweet out stuff and not feel obligated to respond. But I find that difficult because for so many years I've been known as someone to respond. So I feel like it would be very strange if just all of a sudden all I did was tweet and never respond. I don't know.
Well, especially because you are now allowed to espouse more of an opinion, right? First of all,
Yeah.
if the number of times I saw someone reply to you, "Aren't you supposed to be an objective journalist?" and you're like, "No, literally, that's the best part of my new job." Is no.
They'd be mad about me. They would. My current employer. The interesting thing about doing opinion radio is like they love it. Like if people get fired up or whatever, they love it. For me, I have spent most of my career working very hard to be fair. Like, and my wife will always talk about how watching me craft a tweet is a very funny thing to see because I start and then I delete and then I change and then I change one word. Like I think people think that I'm just like spouting off, and I've seen coworkers because my approach when I was in TV, my approach was always to be very opinionated about things that do not matter. So I could have a really strong opinion about, you know, a no parking zone or a restaurant or, somebody chewing gum, whatever, anything that is stupid, whether a taco is a sandwich. Like you can have these very strong opinions, but I would never express any sort of opinion about, anything that was a policy debate or political or religious or anything like that. But people just thought like, oh, Jason can say whatever he wants. I should try to say whatever I want. It's like, no, you should not. Like I've been my my mouth when I was anchoring the news would my mouth almost ran on a delay where you'd be thinking and you wouldn't say it until, it's happening in real time, but I'm always thinking about what I say before I say it. And so doing radio is different, where the charge is to be opinionated and provocative and not like unnecessary, not being like a troll, but people tune in to hear what I think about things, which is very different after 25 years where that's not why people were watching me on TV.
So let's talk a little bit more about the radio show, because we haven't really gotten into that. We talked a lot about your TV. I want to learn a little bit more about just your segue into radio, because that is, as much as it's all media, it was quite a change, honestly, for what you were used to.
Yeah.
What was that? What was the impetus to get into radio, and what was that transition like?
Some of it was just the opportunity, the fact that there was an opening here at a time that I was available. So some of it is 10 years of doing the same thing, the same job, and looking ahead and thinking, well, the only other job at the TV station is the 10 o'clock news. And that team isn't going anywhere. So you say like, all right, do I really want to just keep treading water, or do I want to try to learn something new? Certainly audio and podcasting is such a growing area that I thought, all right, why don't if I ever want to go back to TV, I'm confident I could. But at age 47, I felt too young to be just like treading water at work. So I went for it. I've always loved radio. I grew up listening to talk radio in suburban Chicago. So that, and I had been filling in at WCCO for 10 or 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
But filling in for one day when you still have a main job as a journalist is very different from all of a sudden, now you got to do 5 days of content, 3 hours long, coming up with, 6 to 8 segments, topics every day. 5, we all have opinions. We all have things we want to talk about, but every day trying to think like, all right, what are we going to talk about? I'm a year and a half in now. It turns out there's always a lot to talk about.
I was just going to ask you, where do you get that type of motivation or whatever? I remember when Tim and I first started this, and before we had a format of, of having guests on and things like that, there would be times where we'd come up to the day we were going to record and we'd be like, what are we going to talk about? Did you come up with anything? And no, we didn't. So I can't imagine every day. I mean, obviously there's news and current events or whatever, but where do you get some of that motivation?
So life is show prep. So having kids, being involved in the community, really doing things, going to events, like always you get material and topics from that. I think like the true introverts who don't really leave their house, I wonder maybe this is why people just do like boring kind of talking point, obvious political talk, right? That is easy to do if you want to do that kind of show. if I wanted to do like a far right wing radio show or a far left wing radio show, that would be very easy. That is not what I want to do. So I want to weave lifestyle, entertainment, sports, food, news, all of these things into the show. Um, so I have a producer, Dan Cook is the producer of my show. Dan and I work together starting. He and I exchange emails starting. Well, he emails me at 9. I start working usually at 7. But just looking all over the internet, looking for news stories. We always have a list of things that are ideas, and then we have certain kind of benchmarks where at least every day of the week we have one thing that's set up. So that helps.
But so you mentioned not the going extreme left or extreme right, which I think I've witnessed you be accused of being both.
Yeah. Yes. Which is very frustrating, and very fascinating. You're like, there's a certain segment of the community that thinks I'm like a right wing, like MAGA kind of person. And then everyone who's right wing and MAGA thinks like I'm a member of the Socialist Party. And you're like, well, what we're trying to do. I work at an old school, absolute kind of iconic legacy radio station. WCCO radio is Minnesota's microphone. And my goal with the show has always been to recreate what the conversations I remember around the Thanksgiving dinner table growing up. Passionate opinions, passionate.
Yep.
But you still love each other. You
Yes.
actually listen to other people's viewpoint. Like I don't yell at listeners. I don't call them names. Like I let them say what they think. I will challenge them. I'll push back if I disagree. But sometimes they convince me where I'm like, oh, I was thinking about this wrong, or I didn't have that. I didn't consider that perspective. So I try to do that on social media. That is not what plays on social media. An interesting conversation is not what
Right.
people retweet and spread and whatever. So it's okay. Like people who never listen to me, who think they know my politics. All right. Like that's fine. I mean, definitely. I had a listener come up to me in person, which is always nice when you get to like actually talk to people in the real world, who came up to me and he's like, Jason, you are for sure to the left of me, but you're not nearly as far left as Twitter seems to think you are. He's like, I just appreciate that like you listen to different viewpoints when people call in. And it's like that's all I want to do.
I mean, it's funny to me to see you being accused of being anywhere from MAGA to Antifa, and you're like, I just said I like spaghetti sauce with mushrooms in it. Like I don't, I don't even understand where either of these takes.
Well, in many ways, I'm sort of the most like boring kind of pro-institutional, slow, incremental improvement kind of guy. Like that's where my starting point is, but I can always be convinced, like I'll say, for example, like the defund the police movement. Like to me, the idea of getting rid of police is just absolutely preposterous. Uh, However, like we've been talking about reform in policing for, aggressively, we've been talking about it for 15 years at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're not really seeing, are things changing? Yes. Are we also still seeing like major failures? Yes. So I am empathetic to this conversation where you say like, huh? Like maybe we can't reform this. Maybe we do need to blow it up. And you say like, all right, I'll hear that out. So that is confusing to people, right? Like if I say like the idea of abolishing police to me is preposterous. That said, I haven't really seen any of the reform efforts making marginalized communities feeling safer around police. So maybe there is a problem that's beyond like one bad apple. So anyway, those kind of I feel like that is not that radical of a viewpoint, but like two different people would hear what I just said, and one would say like, "Well, you're a corporate propaganda guy," and the other would say like, "Holy moly, you're standing on the platform saying abolish police." And you're like,
I'm-
Well,
I'm-
Jason, I'm here to tell you that you're both.
I am both. I am. It's true. I'm a suburban living, car loving
Yeah.
guy who likes to ride my bike. I mean, it's
You're-
very
you're-
puzzling.
You're an
Very puzzling.
anarcho-capitalist, which is
I
absolutely.
don't know.
I'm thoroughly convinced you cannot be in the middle. You can't. You can, and the majority of the people are probably there with you. But anywhere on social media, you cannot have a middle of the road opinion because you will get hammered from both sides.
Yeah, I get it. There's an impatience, right, in the fact that people want. There are certain areas where we've seen rapid change as a society, right? We very rapidly went from no gay marriage. Well, we very rapidly went from pretty openly making fun of gay people and using it as a derogatory slur.
Mhm.
And in a couple short decades, most people are like, yeah, that's fine. Let people love who they want to love. And you think like that happens so fast that if you are anywhere else on sort of like you've been waiting for your world to get better, I get why it's frustrating where you're like, well, we can change some things really fast. Why does everything else have to be so incremental? I get it.
So we're gonna take a break here. We're gonna grab a word from our sponsor at Revelton Distilling Company. But when we get back, I wanna talk a little bit about because we have seen some pretty. I mean, Minneapolis was the epicenter of news for a while there. So I want to talk about some of those things where you have seen some of those more radical and challenging things to talk about, and how what your thoughts were on how it was addressed in the media. So with that, I'll give you a chance to kind of prepare for that portion, and we will get a word from our sponsors at Revelton Distilling Company.
At Revelton Distilling Company, everyone has become a part of the Revelton family. From the Taylors and their daughter who helped perfect their award-winning gins, to the team who installed Lucy, our 33-foot-tall custom-made still, right down to the local farms that provide our coveted corn, and even the cows on those farms who consume our mash byproduct. Want to see the farm to flask come to life? Now you can tour Lucy and find out where we take Iowa's harvest and transform it into our finest spirits. Choose between a 45-minute tour or find out even more by scheduling a VIP behind-the-scenes tour to get the taste of the full Revelton experience. You can visit them at 1400 West Clay Street in Osceola, Iowa, or find all of Revelton's award-winning spirits at any local grocery or spirits retailer.
Thank you once again to Revelton Distilling Company listeners. If you are just joining us in this live stream, this is Old Man Strength. In case you stumbled upon this by accident, our guest is Jason DeRusha. Jason, you mentioned growing up in suburban Chicago. Obviously, a lot larger markets than the Twin Cities. Not that we're small, but we are a mid-market. But there have been times in your career. You mentioned earlier the 35W bridge collapse. Obviously, the summer of 2020, where we did become a little bit more of the epicenter of the 24-hour news cycle. First of all, I guess what kind of stands out at you over your 20+ year career covering news in the Twin Cities of when we've kind of been a big deal, and what do you think has been some of the biggest challenges with that?
Well, I was one of the first reporters on scene when the 35W bridge collapsed. And that was pre wide adoption of Twitter or Facebook or social media. That was one of the last major news events in our community anyway that we didn't, we had to wait for the helicopter to get up to get a really good view as to what was going on there. Um, that was a day, like, I remember almost every minute of that day. Arriving on the scene, hearing the sirens coming behind us, and you heard so many sirens. It was like, I remember the photographer, Brad Early, who I was in the car with. We come to a red light, and Brad stops and looks at me, and I'm like, if the bridge really collapsed, no one's going to stop us for running the red light. Let's go. And we went through. And sure enough, you find, then you see people carrying injured people up the banks of the Mississippi River. It was absolutely horrible. And I think I suffered, some after effects of that at that time we weren't really very good at identifying kind of, the mental health aspects of being a journalist as a first responder. Because we always looked at everybody else as like, wow, that's like a serious, you were a paramedic or we're just there recording what's going on. But today, luckily, we have a better handle on that.
Yep.
I think the police protest issue has been fascinating to watch. Because it's a great example of two groups of people talking about two different things and thinking they're talking about the same thing.
For sure.
So, as a media member, some of the protesters, I will say, changed the way that we covered kind of police killings.
Sure.
So before some of these incidents, we would be more passive in our writing. Someone was killed by an officer.
Yeah, not even by an officer. An officer's bullet struck. Like,
yeah, sometimes you would get that in the first thing. Like, people love to grab onto the one worst written example of these kind of things.
But that passed an editor, didn't it?
But breaking news doesn't go through as many people as you think.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
It just doesn't. Now there used to be a lot more cop speak for sure, where you would fall into that rhythm, but now it's a little more active. A police officer, shot someone. We're trying to be more active, more direct, and say what happened. And when you say a police officer shot and killed someone, you're not casting judgment.
No.
As to whether it was justified or not. You're saying what happened. But I'll confess, after years of reporting, only really reporting killings that were not justified, right? Regular kind of homicide. It is a little jarring to go from talking about someone killed someone and saying, well, no, there's no real judgment. Because when you're talking about like a normal non-police involved killing, there is judgment when you say someone shot somebody else. Because when is that justified? Almost never in typical news reporting of that stuff. But I think the protest did a great job of pointing out many ways that like reporting was biased in favor of the police. And just, there are some factors of this that are difficult to change. Right? So when you're covering breaking news, if I'm in a radio newsroom or a TV newsroom and you hear a report of an officer-involved shooting, which is a terminology I hate and would get on the case of my producers all the time, because officer-involved shooting could mean they were shot, could mean they shot someone.
Yeah.
In the early moments, though, you don't know. You really don't know.
Sure, but you never say civilian involved shooting, and that to me is where there's already a bias. That's where I struggle, is you don't say civilian involved shooting, you say officer involved shooting.
Well, yeah, because it's more newsworthy what's the more newsworthy part of it? That there's an officer involved.
Sure. But I don't know. I just
Why would you say, like, we have breaking news, a civilian involved shooting? and also a police officer. It doesn't make any sense.
Sure, but I know you don't know the details in there, but I have a hard time believing that any of those details that come across the desk without knowing whether or not an officer fired a weapon.
You really don't know. You don't know if an officer fired the gun in the opening moments. You generally don't know when over the years, law enforcement has gotten way worse at sharing information. When I first started out in Rockford, Illinois, when I was 20, you could arrive at a crime scene and the cops would let you inside the crime tape
Mm-hmm.
and they would tell you what was going on. And today you're kept 5 blocks away waiting for some PIO to show up and tell you whatever 7 people removed told them. So
I mean,
the pipeline is worse. The reliability is worse.
don't you think that's eroded? You think of the Twin Cities, right? Geronimo Yanez, Mohammed Noor. We got a lot of facts well after the fact because both of those did get filtered through PIOs, right?
Right.
Right. We got a lot of those facts later that turned out to not comport with the early narrative.
Right.
Right.
So what would you suggest? Like, how should the media cover those things then? In a time when immediate police scanner reporting is the norm on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do if you're a TV station?
I guess to me that's fair. I don't have the right answer. It feels like that the first information to get reported by media is what the police narrative is.
Of course, because where else are you going to get information from?
Where else do you get any information on any story, though? You don't have to go to the...
Think about it, Tim. If you're talking about someone, say a police officer shoots you.
Sure.
So where am I supposed to get your side of the story from?
The best side of the story we got on George Floyd was by the young woman who filmed that encounter. So
Yes.
so you had a first person eyewitness encounter that was more accurate than what the police information officer had given out.
Yeah.
I guess to me,
which
that's what
we
I'm saying.
knew, and that's why that was reported the way it was. So I can tell you firsthand about that whole incident.
Yeah.
Because that happened in the overnight. The shooting happened during the night, but in the overnight hours is when we first saw her video. And I reached out to her on Facebook and said, did you shoot? Think of the questions you have to ask her. Did you shoot this video? You posted it. Did you shoot it? I, in that early morning, was taking a look at her video and comparing it to Google Maps to make sure it was the same location.
Sure.
Did we really know?
Right.
We didn't know. We didn't know any.
But
so we knew that at 5 a.m, and then that certainly colored the way we reported the story all morning, and that's why it was national news by 7 a.m. because of her video.
Sure, but I guess what I would say is that there's a lot of journalistic integrity into getting down to the using Google Maps to figure out if that is really truly the location. Do you really feel like the media uses Google Maps to really figure out if the police report really fits the narrative, or do you think they're already given undue authority based on their report said this?
Yeah, they are given undue authority because they have a pipeline to share information.
Yeah, and I guess that's my point.
Yeah, which is fine. Like, I understand why people get mad about that, but I also will say, like, the people who get most mad about this have already decided how they feel about this issue. And so they love to grab the very first report, which is wrong, right? So they grab, the PIO said this in a statement. Well, what time was that statement issued? How did the news media report that? How, I feel like there's this indictment that, like, is it true? Is it not? Did it get widely reported? I don't know. Like, George Floyd was murdered at what, 6 or 7 in the evening? So I don't know, like, what the report was in the 10 o'clock news, but in the morning news, like, we had a better handle on the situation. I think as consumers, like, the media has to be more clear in saying this is the police version. Often the police version the first version differs from what we learn. I think that's valid to say in our reporting, right?
And I think that's
and we
something
do that more now.
I was gonna say and that was one thing I was going to say specifically. What I think is different because of George Floyd is that you see way more often the initial reports vary, and I feel like that to me is probably the more fair thing.
Yeah, you have to say that. You do. But the
Right?
truth is, like, getting access to this other, like the video we got of George Floyd wasn't posted until the overnight hours.
Sure.
So I think there's this idea that, like, oh, well, if the media would actually go out and talk to witnesses, well, I just think critics should maybe go to a crime scene and see how viable that is in the breaking news moments. You are always trying to talk to people, but if it's something big that's worth reporting, like, often you're not even allowed anywhere close to be able to do anything. Now, social media has changed it where you can get, but a lot of times the witnesses tell a false story too, right?
Sure. And the witnesses tell a false story in the 35
Way more often, the witness's story doesn't line up with what we end up seeing in body camera video. Witness reports, police witness reports, and civilian witness reports are notoriously unreliable.
Sure. No, I don't doubt that at all. I guess what I'm saying is when you compare something like the 35W bridge collapse, that was not an officer involved bridge collapse, right? So there's not a bias in the way that a police officer or first responder would be responding to that. When it's an officer involved shooting, there's already a bias injected. And then I mean, because we also saw, I mean, literally the attorney general's office said that the way the police had handled the press throughout the protests after the fact was a systemic problem within the Minneapolis Police Department.
Oh, for sure.
That journalists were treated very poorly. It feels very weird to me to have, again, when a news story happens, a tornado hits, yes, take the words of the first responders because there's a neutral part in that. But the second there's an officer involved shooting, you automatically have a bias thing. And I guess I just wish there were a little bit more. And I do feel like since George Floyd, you have seen a lot more of the initial police reports are subject to change type of thing. I think that language has gotten.
It's a hard. I mean, the practical side of this is more challenging to execute, right? I will say on radio, I'm allowed more. And if I ever went back to TV, I would bring a lot of what I'm able to do in radio just because I have more time. And so you can raise like, all right, here are the questions we have and just say it. Like, here's what it is. Like a lot of times I think TV news, needs to kind of take off some of the conventions and just tell the listeners, here are the things we don't know. We don't know this. We don't know that. We don't know this. Here's what police are saying. Here's what we know. Like, just the more clear you can be about that stuff, I think the better.
And I think that's probably what I'm getting at, right? Is the idea of here's what the police are saying, here's what we can report. And I feel
like how often does this come up? Like, people who don't generally watch the news have been ripping the news for 3 years because some PIO sent out a bunch of lies. And you're like, give me a break. Like, people are out there covering stories and trying to get the facts of things every day, over and over.
And I'm not saying that I'm criticizing the media on everything. I'm saying that particularly when it comes to
these shootings,
to officer involved shootings, passive language, right? And we had the PIO for the Des Moines Police Department on, friend of the podcast. I would give him the same challenges, right? There's still the best part about the First Amendment is that we have a free and independent press. And when police officers are agents of the state, to give a bias towards the agents of the state kind of defeats the point of a free and independent press.
Go ahead, Jason. I'll let you respond, and then I'll chime in here.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's always the case. I think that is sometimes the case, right? Sometimes the version they give you is true.
Absolutely.
It's hard. It's hard. I think there is a responsibility on the consumer to stick with a story and don't let the first version of the story define your understanding as to what actually happened. To a certain degree, the audience wants us to tell what we've learned immediately.
Hmm.
And then at the same time, they're like, well, why are you reporting this stuff? Why don't you wait longer and go talk to
and
more
make
people?
sure it's accurate.
You're
Oh,
like, well,
well,
it's a challenge. It's a
I
challenge
think
of our
there's
real
a
time.
lot. I think that there's a lot of nuances to this conversation as well. There's the fork in the road of the media. I think is certainly under attack in this day and age of having agendas and not telling the truth. There's a large assault on the news organizations to decredit them because the enemy of the state and that whole narrative, which we had talked about, Tim,
Mhm.
with Elias and things like that. There you have that particular issue that is leading into some of the conversation that you're having. But then you also have, and you're right, we have had the Des Moines PIO here, and I've heard him on several occasions, give his reasoning for sometimes why the reports that they give are not necessarily all of the information, because it is an open investigation and they do have to be understanding of that as well. And I don't know if that's, but to your point, Tim, I'm sure there is a bias in how they handle that because it is an officer involved shooting. So I think all of those things are going on. It's very hard to find a middle ground on that.
Tim's points are accurate, that these are all things that good journalists are thinking about today. And I don't know that that was the case 5 years ago.
Right.
So I do think that is really good news. The worst thing, the biggest threat is that politicians, police, government, anything related to the state is buttoning it down.
Mhm.
Like, it's never been
Yes.
harder to get people to return media phone calls, to do interviews, to tell us to take tough questions. It's really difficult because people feel they can just talk to their own supporters. And I think it's a threat to democracy, the fact that our local governments, our state governments are trying to go into hiding. I don't like it.
I mean, I'm a very huge defender of an independent press, and I think that's what I think becomes the challenge for me the most. Is when it feels like there is. I don't want I'm not saying it's collusion. I'm just saying that I appreciate more here's what police are saying, here's what we know right now, and parsing the two. Because I feel like a lot of times there's not a lot of explicit parsing between here's what we are learning as journalists and here are what police are reporting. It seems like it becomes very kind of melded together. And I think, again, like I said, Geronimo Yanez, Muhammad Noor, like the true narrative came out to be very even with Derek Chauvin, the true narrative came out to be very different as that story evolved. And I get that all stories are going to evolve. It just is frustrating that the first and most prominent voice doesn't get more parsed by that language. If we're going to give the police officers the benefit of the doubt of officer involved shooting, why can't we give eyewitnesses or anyone else the benefit of the doubt that narrative might also be wrong?
I'll tell you, the other part of this, though, is that there's such distrust of media and big organizations that now eyewitnesses don't want to talk. And you're like, well, we had a mass shooting in Minneapolis at a house that was having like a punk music party. And it took like 3 or 4 days before any of the people who were at that thing actually talked to a reporter. And they weren't talking to police either. And you're like,
well, don't you think?
One.
Well, don't you think that's the tail wagging the dog a little bit, though?
What do you mean?
I mean, if I'm positing that people don't trust the media because the media toes the police line and they're not going to talk to police, they're not also going to talk to media. Like I feel like Like,
I
doesn't
think
that
you're giving people too much credit for like actually being like that sophisticated of a consumer of media. I think people have just decided this because I don't think that's a fair critique. I really don't. I
okay?
think you can point to, I mean, we can point to the highest profile incidents because that's what people pay attention to.
Sure.
And I would say that's not a fair judgment of the fact that people are out there doing this kind of journalism and every day. So,
Right.
like, you brought up Mohammed Noor, the officer who killed Justine Damon. I mean, that was 2019. That was 4 years ago. So,
Mhm.
like, not that it's not a valid thing to bring up. I would just say like people have learned. And so if the challenge is don't just report the police narrative, report the witness narrative, I'm 100% with that. But people have to talk to us too.
I brought up Mohammed Noor and I brought up Geronimo Yanez because I think that eroded people's trust.
It did. It did. But today
Yeah.
we have body camera video that's generally released within 2 days. So, like, this idea that there's like a totally made up narrative that's hanging around for a long time, I don't know. Like, I'm trying to think of the last major incident where it was a major about face as to what was happening. And the last one that involved a police officer was that federal drug task force that uh, was in uptown Minneapolis.
Yeah.
And it turns out that, like, the police, despite what the victim's girlfriend, who was sitting in the front seat while all this went down, was saying in news conferences, there's actually video that the man who was killed, uh, this video was recovered from his phone. And it turned out like he knew they were task force agents. He
Yep.
knew what
Yep.
it totally exonerated the task force version in a case where the task
Sure.
force had no body camera video. So that was the latest one where you're like, all right. I mean, a lot of these, I go into it now for sure believing no one.
Well, and I guess
Which is how we're supposed to do our
Well,
job.
and I think and I think that's ultimately what I get into is I feel like there's a responsibility to believe no one, and I feel like that's where the challenge has been is that
Yeah.
it's believe no one but report.
I agree.
this
And
with passive
the
language.
challenge is that when you're only getting information, because how are you going to get information from the non-police version of these incidents, right? So just the practical measure, like somebody should start some agency where they are the PR person for everyone involved in every crime. And then they can tell us, like, how do you get like to this idea that you're espousing, which I agree with you. I totally agree with you, Tim, because the idea is to get the most accurate and complete version of what happened, which you can only get by reporting what a bunch of people are telling you. But
so
the challenge is how do you get it? How do you get it in real time? How do you get it quickly?
well, when the 35W
It's
bridge
tough.
collapse went down, all of the interviews I saw were people who were there, who were eyewitnesses. I don't remember nearly as many first responder or police officer interviews as I
It's
do
so
eyewitness
different
ones.
from a shooting where it's so different. It's so different. This scene was spread. The 35W bridge collapse was a scene that was spread out over a half mile.
Yeah,
And so
and George Floyd had how many eyewitnesses?
they all testified it was what, 12, 18?
Yeah, and I guess I get my point
But
is
that there wasn't a massive news media response to the crime scene there.
yeah, well,
Because it didn't seem like anything. You didn't hear it over the scanners. You didn't know it was going down. So
yeah,
they're all so different.
yeah,
Each one is so different.
yeah,
But I'm just telling you, in a normal incident where someone is killed by a police officer, the ability to get there and talk to an eyewitness is so small.
sure. Okay.
Especially because it gets shut down. So then you have to try to find these people, and often they share information on social media,
Right.
and that's sort of how you get it. But it's not like there were camera crews at the murder of George Floyd. There weren't. It was the cell phone videos, thank goodness,
Right.
of the witnesses who recorded it.
Mhm.
But otherwise, there were no cameras. You would show up and get like maybe some cop car lights after the fact.
Mhm.
Well, and any eyewitness is probably corralled by the police to get their statement and are probably held off
Yeah,
so that they're
long
not
gone.
giving that out
Long gone.
because they don't, again, they don't want to, in their mind, ruin the investigation or jeopardize an
Well,
investigation.
we
or
usually
whatever.
just show up so late. Like I don't think
Right,
with
yeah.
with George Floyd, I don't think any reporters, no one even knew about it until the statement came out, which
Yeah.
of course turned out to be a BS statement. But
Well, yeah, exactly.
But
And
that's
that
why
again,
I don't even think that statement was very widely reported because when you got that statement, you would have thought like, not sure that's newsworthy.
Yeah.
Someone had a medical incident while they were being arrested. You'd be like, we'll check into that tomorrow. Well, before,
If at all.
yeah, I mean, you would check into it because when someone dies in police custody, but you would check it out tomorrow. You wouldn't necessarily put that on TV as breaking news. And then, of course, the video came out, and then so did the truth.
Crazy.
It is crazy. Thank God for that video.
Yes.
So let's go ahead and grab a word from our second sponsor, Kyle Lehman at Wintrust Mortgage. Chris, do you want to go and tee this one up?
Yep. So we're gonna kind of switch gears here a little bit, Jason. We normally ask a sponsored question. I was gonna use your tagline, but I feel like that would be stealing, so I won't do that.
You're allowed. You're allowed.
But it's the Wintrust Mortgage sponsored question. I'm gonna give you the question. We'll play the ad, and then I'll give you time to think of an answer. So,
All right.
you have a magic, fancy DeLorean time machine. Go back 10 years to 2013. What piece of advice are you going to give Jason in 2013? So with that, we're going to play a quick word from Kyle at Wintrust Mortgage, and we'll be right back.
Are you in the market for a new house and unsure of the mortgage process? Want to know that you have someone looking out for you? Kyle Lehman from Wintrust Mortgage is a down-to-earth, knowledgeable lender who can be there for you in your corner. He can work with you in any of the 50 states and is just what you need to expand your home search. Kyle will work with you through the entire process with little to no work from you. Take the worry of the mortgage process out of the equation so that you can focus on looking for your dream home. Contact Kyle at www.wintrust.com/Kyle-Lehman or call him at 515-473-0546.
All right. And we're back. Thank you so much. If you are in the market looking for a house, please give Kyle a call. He did a great series on first-time homeowners and buyers and can walk you right through that process. So, Jason, before the ad, we did ask you the Wintrust Kyle Mortgage of the Pod. You have a magic time machine, DeLorean, Lamborghini, whatever you want to call it. You go back 10 years. You're going to give one piece of advice to yourself in 2013. What's that piece of advice?
Well, I would have told myself not to pick up that pumpkin the other day that caused me to strain my back. So if I could have told myself that, would have been outstanding. I think I would tell myself to not be afraid to take a risk. So I think my career progression was largely as predictable as someone kind of marching through the steps in television news would have seen, and it worked out great. I loved every step of it. But, over the last year and a half, when I took a risk and said, let's try something new, I've just really enjoyed being a student in a way again and learning and doing a job where you're good at it, but not great at it. And you're like, it's incredibly invigorating to like fail and suck and be like, this was bad. And then you could try tomorrow and you're like, I'm not going to make that same mistake. Like having that freedom to take a risk is something I wish I gave myself a little earlier.
Great answer. Great answer.
I like that. So, I mean, you did take a huge risk to get out of a very big comfort zone, to get into radio, to do something very different, to introduce yourself to a brand new audience too, right? I mean,
right? Yeah.
You had to have noticed an audience shift. Certainly. Did you notice that on social media as well as you shifted from TV to radio?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure on the social media side of it. Certainly, like, the topics that I talk about are, people, depending on the people who engage in it, it ends up kind of bursting into other people's kind of circles and that sort of thing. No one fully understands the mystery of how all of this works, but uh, it that has been interesting for sure. It's when you spend 20 years at the same TV station, the audience really gets to know you for that. It has been fun. It's taken about a year and a couple months, but now people are coming up to me and like, "Oh, I heard you talk about this," or "I like how you talk about this," or "I heard your show," or making an inside joke about something I mentioned on the show. And so that's been really fun. Being on from 3 to 6 in the afternoon, I have people who listen to me on their drive home who really didn't know me from
Yeah.
morning news because they were either, maybe they weren't up.
Yeah.
I mean, with my current schedule, I wake up at like 3:45. I sometimes catch the last 3 minutes of the local morning show, but that's about it. So there are all sorts of people who never, for the last 10 years, never really saw me on TV. So that's kind of fun to have that new audience too.
Do you get a big Instagram lawn care influencer?
Boy, that has been funny. After I announced I was leaving TV, but I didn't say what I was doing, a friend of mine started an Instagram page called DeRusha Seeds, where
It was
my food coverage is DeRusha Eats. So DeRusha Seeds is all the lawn care content.
it's been brilliant, honestly.
Pretty funny. It's just been, and some people legitimately thought I was leaving television to go into a career of lawn influencer. Like, I don't think that's equal pay as to what I was getting in TV, but
You were going to be the new
it's been
PIO
fun.
officer. That's what you were going to do.
It is funny how many people say like, "Oh, I love your lawn stuff," and you're like, "Oh man, we were just doing that as a goof." So that's been really fun.
It's been pretty entertaining. I'm not gonna lie. Well, okay. So you talk about DeRusha Eats. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I did want to.
Yeah.
I did want to talk a little bit about this, just because uh, that's probably been one of those more fun things you've been able to do,
Oh, yeah.
and dare I say a perk, but it's one of those things where you've been able to
Quite
cover
some perk.
what I think is a honestly a probably underrated, more robust uh, uh, culinary scene here in the Twin Cities than maybe we're given credit for sometime. But what have you noticed that has kind of changed in the Twin Cities dining bar restaurant scene?
Well, for sure, like post-COVID, nobody knows what's going on, right? Like it's hard to know what consumers want now. It's hard to know what business models are going to work. It's all sort of chaotic right now.
Sure.
But I've been writing about restaurants for 15 years. I started doing suburban restaurant reviews in Minnesota Monthly. I spent a little time writing for Minneapolis St. Paul magazine. Now I'm back at Minnesota Monthly. The biggest thing that's changed is that talented chefs would leave the Midwest, leave Des Moines, leave Minneapolis, and go to New York or LA or Vegas. That's where you would go. And because it's so competitive in those markets and rent is so expensive, our chefs who have gone to great places are coming home to open great places here. And so what's exciting now is you're starting to see the ripple effect from those first chefs who came from New York and came back home. Now their proteges are starting to open up restaurants. And so that's going to be really interesting to see, like, what will that do to the restaurant scene? Post-COVID, I mean, the biggest change is that late night, and by late night, I mean after 9 p.m., even on a weekend, is pretty dead.
Yeah.
So city restaurants used to get 3 turns. You'd get like a 5 o'clock crowd, you'd get a 7 o'clock crowd, and then you'd get like an 8:30 to 9:30 crowd. So you could get 3 turns. Suburban restaurants would usually get 2 turns. And so if you were going to have a successful suburban restaurant, you would usually need a parking lot with at least 100 spots because you're only doing 2 turns and everybody comes at the same time. The city restaurants are starting to have some of that suburban dining pattern, which is really, really bad for the business model. It's really bad. And because business attendance in person is so low, like a lot of the happy hour bump that some restaurants were getting is also going away.
I think it
So
was
that's been tough.
I think it was maybe Resi. Someone recently released I think it was Resi, released a report that said that average reservation time moved from 8 o'clock to 6 o'clock.
Yeah. Yeah. It's
Who eats
It's
dinner at
interesting.
8 o'clock? Aren't
Yeah.
you guys in bed by 8:30?
You know,
Most of the civilized world.
normal cities, like you're at work until 6, you go get a drink.
I'm in
know,
Des Moines.
like-
I'm home by 7:30.
Yeah, you're Des
well,
Moines. The Des Moines, and Des Moines has had a very growing restaurant
Yeah,
scene
it
and
has. Yeah.
as well. And we're starting, one of the negatives for Minneapolis is just in a time where the Twin Cities was starting to get some national love for having a robust and interesting dining scene. You have, people like Ann Kim, who was on that Netflix pizza show. So you get some of this national buzz. At the same time, really mid to small size markets like Des Moines are developing their own scene. So I worry a little bit that like what used to be a bit of a differentiator for us is becoming more common all over the country. You sort of expect any decent sized city to have, 10 or 15 interesting, good restaurants, and we're sort of there.
I've always regretted that we don't have a signature cuisine. You know what I mean? Like
I agree. Totally agree.
Cities are known for X, Y, and Z.
Yes.
You
The
can't.
Philly cheesesteak. You wish we had that, or the deep dish pizza, or the what do we have? We have the stupid Juicy Lucy.
We have the Juicy Lucy, which
There's
if
nothing
people
wrong with that.
well, if people even know it, and
fine.
also it's gonna take 20 minutes to make a damn cheeseburger that
You're gonna.
is going to burn your mouth and be half undercooked.
I mean, we're happy for it. It's better than Hot Dish, which was our. But yeah, we don't
Or
really
Lutefisk.
have Lutefisk. Yeah, we don't really have a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's certainly
which is kind of a
nothing
bummer.
like when my friends, my friend comes up from New Orleans. He's like, "Well, what is the Minnesota thing?" And I'm like,
We got some trout.
Beer.
"Yeah,
Good beer.
r-
Craft beer scene's pretty good. We got that going.
apologizing." I think that's
We're good at apologizing. Yeah, we'll have to see what's
Some
going to
kind of
happen with our.
casserole.
I mean, what's interesting is the younger generation doesn't view dining as much of an entertainment source as I think we did.
Yeah.
And so a lot of restaurants were sort of, the beneficiary of the fact that what did people do for fun in the 2000 to 2020? Well, people went out to eat. That was pretty much the cultural touchstone moment. And I think we're on the way down. I think that's changing.
That's because this generation DoorDashes everything. They don't go anywhere. They don't go out anywhere.
DoorDash certainly helps. Also, just the
True.
fact that this is definitely where I'm going to get to be a grumpy old man. Everything is so gosh darn expensive these days. Like
Well, people say that, but they will spend so much money in DoorDash fees and
Yes.
tips and all of that.
Yes.
And
you know what, man, $96 and I pay for my DoorDash right away.
yeah, it's amazing. Like eating out is for sure more expensive.
Yeah.
And restaurants have always been built on making their money on alcohol
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
sort of underpricing the food. That was sort of the business model. And the problem now, generationally, is that the 20 somethings are not drinking the same way that the 30, 40, 50 somethings.
No, and now you're seeing $9.
It's very different.
Now you're seeing $9 a pint, which feels like we're like
It's crazy.
we're 5 years removed from $5 a pint. Like the way that has grown.
Yep. And people are right to push back on that. Like
Yeah.
it's ridiculous. But restaurants don't have the guts to actually price their food at the price that it should be priced at because they worry that they'll get destroyed by someone else. But I think there has to be an overall kind of reckoning. And
Yeah.
to a certain degree, some places are probably using fancy, expensive ingredients that they don't need to be using.
Well, I think
Cut some costs, figure
I
it
think
out.
I think traditionally we've already accepted that food margins are razor thin, and it all exists in liquor. That we haven't realized that maybe you can take a little bit more pricing on food. You don't have to take it all in
Yeah.
liquor. Like
Yeah.
you don't always have to take the
Agreed.
exact same mix. I think that's been a struggle. Well, and then also, some of these, certain neighborhoods in Minneapolis where you have to, restaurants where bars were going out of the way to sell you a $5 mint and a $3 beer to get to your
Right.
your mix, right? And like some
Yeah.
of those things too.
Yeah, I mean, all of it it's all in the mix. But you have to consider, like, over 15 years, what has changed? Well, you have craft beer,
Mhm.
kind of tap rooms all over the place. You have
Mhm.
food trucks, which didn't exist before. You have grocery stores that are providing takeout food that's, in some cases, as good as sit-down restaurants.
Yeah.
So in Des Moines, in Minneapolis, we have added so many different places that are serving restaurant food, quote unquote, and we haven't added population.
Yeah.
So if you think about all those seats, right? Like every year, the number of restaurants that open and close, it's generally not that different. So there's always everything that closes, you almost always see those spaces getting filled. And then suburban areas are getting more restaurants out there. So at a certain point, you have to say, like, maybe we have too many restaurants for the number of people who want to eat out. There just might be too many restaurants.
It
Yeah.
cracks me up because for the last 10 years I've heard about a craft beer bubble. 10 years I've heard about a craft beer
It's gonna
bubble.
burst.
And I keep on saying, hey, first of all, economic bubbles are misunderstood. Yeah, there was a .com bubble. Guess what? .coms didn't go away. The
No.
internet didn't die because there was a
Right.
.com bubble. Like I think people assume that a craft beer bubble means craft beer is going to die.
No,
I think
absolutely not.
that's
I
bullshit.
just
But also the fact that craft beer for the length that, like, a craft brewery is open 9 years and closes, and people go, "Oh, what a failure." A restaurant is open for 5 years and closes, and people go, "What a great run they had."
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
no kidding. I just hope the podcast bubble doesn't burst. Actually, I would like for it to start to happen. That would
Yeah,
be that
yeah,
would be what I
exactly.
really want to happen.
Well, Jason, we got one more question we want to ask you before we let you go. Thank you very much for taking a little bit extended time. But it's been fun talking with you. I very rarely get an opportunity to troll you for this long.
That's right.
It's usually in much
Right.
much
That's right.
smaller bursts.
I'm
So
stuck. I'm stuck here.
I
That's
know.
right.
I can't wait for the next time I see you in person. You're going to be in trouble. So anyway, we do have one more question, and this question is actually brought to you by. Well, actually, this isn't even a question. This is just an opportunity for you to say what is on your mind. Brought to you by our friend Steph Copley. Chris, go ahead and introduce the Steph Copley.
Yes, so
stick.
famously, Steph Copley, a friend of the pod, was on the podcast. At one point, she told Tim to shut the fuck up because he wouldn't stop talking. So we decided to make that a sponsored segment. In honor of Steph Copley, we will play a little bit of a clip here and invite you to donate to the Young Women's Resource Center that dedicates themselves to help empower and lift up women. And then when we come back, Jason, Tim and I are going to shut the fuck up, and you get to say whatever you want without any kind of an interruption. So we'll be right back.
Hey everybody, it's Steph Copley, the woman behind the STFU segment on the Old Man Strength podcast. When I told the guys I wanted to sponsor this segment, they recommended that I make a charitable donation instead, so that's what I did. I chose the Young Women's Resource Center in Des Moines, Iowa. They're a nonprofit that supports, educates, and advocates for girls and young women ages 10 to 24. Their whole goal is to make sure that these young women become strong, self-confident, and successful. And if you know me at all, you know that aligns with my goals as well. If you're interested and would like to donate, check them out at ywrc.org and donate today. And remember, don't forget to STFU and listen every once in a while. Thanks.
All right. And as usual, Steph does such a great job on her podcast So, Jason, this is your time. Tim will shut the fuck up, and you get to say whatever you want.
Well, I have been looking for the opportunity to come on a podcast by white guys and just point out there's too damn many podcasts. We do not need this podcast, Old Man Strength, unnecessary. No one needs, look, white middle-aged guys already have a home for commentary. It is called News Radio 830 WCCO. I have a show from 3 to 6. That's enough. I don't need competition with other kind of dopey looking white guys in front of their kind of lame ass camera going on about stuff that no one cares about but them. That is my territory. And I wish, if we're going to abolish something, let's abolish white guys on podcasts. Please join me in my effort. Abolish now. Will you sign the pledge? Chris and Tim.
So we'd like to welcome Jason on for the very last time.
Because, the demographics of old white men are just totally underserved.
Underserved.
Yeah. Well.
Thank you both for what you do.
That was perfect.
Self-interest, bias, you saw it all right there.
That was great. That was wonderful. Jason, I would expect nothing. Yes, and as Denny says,
Right,
with
Denny.
old white guy listeners. Absolutely. Jason, thank you very much for taking time out of your evening. I don't get to see you enough. Hopefully I'll see you around town here soon. But
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason.
This has been a lot of fun. Yeah, absolutely. With that, listener, you have been listening to Old Man Strength, the podcast of Three Beards Media, brought to you by Revelton Distilling. If you are not checking out all the other pods we have on Three Beards Media, we have a lot of fun things. We cover anything from sports to politics to pop culture to ostensibly beer, although I haven't recorded that podcast in a while. That's on me. A little bit of everything. So please go ahead and check out everything else. Go ahead and check us out on the social medias. I'm not even going to put them all out there. You can go ahead and find us Strength
There's
_
no
Old
shortage
on Twitter.
of other white guys on this. There's no shortage
absolutely.
of other white guys on this media.
Yeah, absolutely. So please go ahead and check us out, as well as our friend Kyle Lehman at Wintrust Mortgage. And with that, dear listeners, we will see you guys next time.